Russian President Vladimir Putin never expected Ukraine to have so many allies willing to donate military equipment to its cause. He certainly never expected that those allies would still be donating over 3 years into an invasion that was only supposed to last 5 days. But they are, and now Putin is in big trouble. Why? Denmark has just announced its latest military aid round and is about to help Ukraine unleash terrifying firepower with a huge artillery package. Putin is rattled by Denmark's historic move, but he's not as rattled as his forces will be once the Danish shells start flying on the Ukrainian battlefield. On May 18, Denmark announced that it had prepared its 26th military aid package for Ukraine. Valued at about $598 million, the package delivers several key weapons and components Ukraine needs to maintain its defense against Putin's marauding forces. The headline is that Ukraine is about to receive artillery shells. A lot of artillery shells. Provided by the Czech Ammunition Initiative, these shells will be shipped into Ukraine to help it defend itself against the artillery barrage Russia has instituted since Putin invaded. It's an eye for an eye approach. Putin pelts Ukraine's defenses with his artillery, and thanks to Denmark, Ukraine now has plenty of shells it can use to batter Russia's attacks and create gaps in their defenses for Ukraine to exploit. Denmark explained its reasoning for the latest donation when making its announcement. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian need for help and support has not diminished, read a statement published on the Danish government website. The country's Minister of Defense, Troels Lund Poulsen, added, "I'm happy and proud that we can once again allocate funds for donations that will make a difference on the battlefield in both the short and long term. Denmark has been a faithful supporter of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. We will continue to be so in the coming years." That statement sends a clear message to Putin. Denmark isn't going anywhere. The Danish Foreign Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, had his own comments. "From the Danish side, we're doing what we can to give Ukraine the best cards in hand, both on the battlefield and in the negotiation room. The best we can do here and now is to increase military support for Ukraine and strengthen Ukrainian defense capabilities. That's why I'm pleased that we can help give the Ukrainian defense a $1 billion boost with another Danish donation package," he said. That's even more for Putin to worry about. Denmark is telling him that it understands that the best way for Ukraine to gain leverage over Russia in ongoing ceasefire negotiations is to make Ukraine as strong as possible. The logic checks out. Putin thinks he can drag peace discussions along because Russia has the advantage in Ukraine. The stronger Ukraine becomes, the more that advantage diminishes. Russia's leverage falls as a result, allowing Ukraine to ask for more if and when Putin finally comes to the table. Worse yet for Russia, Denmark says that it's making its donations with an eye toward the future. Even if the Ukraine invasion ends with Ukraine coming out on top, Denmark will continue to support its ally so that it's ready if Russia invades again. There's something else that's noteworthy here. Denmark says that it's making its artillery donation via the Czech Ammunition Initiative. That initiative is massive for Ukraine. Back in March 2024, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that his country had raised enough money to buy 800,000 artillery shells that it could send to Ukraine. However, there was consternation over those figures. Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala said that the real number was closer to 300,000, with the first donation of that ammunition set to enter Ukraine in June 2024. Despite this strange start, the Czech Ammunition Initiative was up and running. By June, it had delivered 50,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition for Ukraine's artillery guns, and it's been making regular donations ever since. By October 2024, the Czech Republic claimed that it had sent a third of what was now 500,000 promised shells, with the rest set to arrive by the end of 2024. That alone would be worrying enough for Putin. However, the numbers had rocketed up by the time Reuters reported on the Czech Republic's ambition to keep its initiative running into 2025 and beyond. In February, the outlet claimed that the Czechs now say they've delivered 1.6 million shells to Ukraine, with more on the way. How did the number jump up so rapidly? Pavel explained during an appearance at the Munich Defense Conference, stating, "We've secured from our allies sufficient resources to cover Ukraine's need until April of this year. And also here at the conference, I negotiated allies to consider providing more resources." Translation, it's not just the Czechs providing artillery to Ukraine through their initiative. A lot of other countries are involved. Denmark is just one of 18 countries that have pledged their support to the Czech scheme, with Belgium, Norway, Germany, the Netherlands and Canada being among the rest that are providing much needed shells to Ukraine via the Czech Republic. Germany has played a big role. As of the end of 2024, it was the top donor to the Czech Initiative, providing financing for the first batch of shells that arrived in Ukraine back in June. Therein lies the key. Ukraine's allies are paying money to buy shells manufactured in the Czech Republic, and these aren't donations from existing stockpiles. They're new shells being built specifically for the purpose of hurting Putin's forces. It's enough to cover Ukraine's artillery usage for several months at a key juncture in its defense against Putin's forces. Denmark provided a little more insight into where the money for these shells came from in its statement revealing the donation. The initial batch of 800,000 rounds Pavel claimed to have secured for Ukraine was created using $3.3 billion of donations from the 18 nations involved in the Czech Ammunition Initiative. And Denmark's statement revealing their latest donation notes these shells were financed by a combination of its own Ukraine Fund, which is a framework for Denmark's military support, and reimbursement revenue from the European Peace Facility. It hopes that the money being provided to the Czech initiative will help provide Ukraine with a stable flow of artillery, allowing it to plan operations in more depth during the coming months. That's all bad news for Putin. But it gets even worse for Russia's leader. Artillery shells aren't the only thing Ukraine will be receiving, courtesy of the Danes. The artillery donation is just the largest part of a donation that will also include equipment for Ukraine's F-16 fighter jets and money dedicated to further training for Ukraine's forces. In other words, it's not just a new round of explosive firepower that Russia's troops have to worry about. Denmark is also making Ukraine stronger in the skies. Fighter jet equipment, which could range from missiles through to components that keep the jets in the air, allow Ukraine to present even more of an aerial threat to Russian forces. Add new training into the mix, and you get even more Ukrainians who are capable of maximizing that threat. Denmark's latest donation only reinforces the steadfast support it's shown to Ukraine since the onset of Russia's invasion. According to official statements, Denmark has allocated a total of 66.1 Danish kroner, approximately $9.9 billion, to its Ukraine fund for the years 2023 to 2028. This substantial commitment highlights Denmark's dedication to bolstering Ukraine's defense capabilities over the long term. Denmark has taken an interesting approach to providing military aid to Ukraine. Most of Ukraine's Western partners provide aid directly. Take the US as an example. Most of its donations to Ukraine are made directly from US stockpiles. The US allocates funds, but it isn't typically spending money to build new weapons. Instead, it says that it will provide X amount of support to Ukraine and then pulls weapons from its stockpiles collectively, worth whatever X is, to send to Ukraine. Denmark does things differently. Most of its funding for Ukraine is provided by something called the Danish model. Under this model, Denmark commits to buying weapons and equipment from Ukraine itself, which it then sends back to Ukraine to help it fend off Putin's forces. It's an interesting approach and one that's designed to strengthen Ukraine's domestic arms manufacturing industry. The Kyiv Independent highlighted why the Danish model could prove so important to Ukraine moving forward. As of April 2024, Ukraine's defense industry had the capacity to build around $20 billion of weapons annually. The problem, then and now, is that Ukraine's defense budget isn't high enough to make full use of that capacity. Last year, Ukraine could only spend around $6 billion on the weapons its own industry produced, leaving it with a question. What happens to the other $14 billion of weapons? If Ukraine weren't at war, the answer would be simple. It could sell those weapons, making billions of dollars in the process, which could fund further investment into its military. But Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of time required to see that approach through. It needs the weapons its manufacturers are producing to fight against Putin's forces. Enter the Danish model. With this model, Denmark is buying some of these weapons that Ukraine's defense industry produces, but its military can't afford. Those weapons are then donated to Ukraine, never even having to leave the country, so that its military has them available as soon as possible. Granted, Denmark's 26 military aid package doesn't make use of the Danish model precisely in this sense. However, sending money to the Czech Ammunition Initiative follows a similar concept. Denmark spends money to help the Czech industry build thousands of shells, which are then transferred to Ukraine. None of the shells come from Denmark's stockpiles. Instead, it's using its donations to strengthen Ukraine, maintain its own power, and build up the European defense industry so that it can produce more weapons now and in the future. It's a brilliant model that circumvents the stockpile challenges many of Ukraine's allies now have. Putin is terrified of the Danish model. He knows that it's the key to reinvigorating the Ukrainian and European defense industries. But he can't do anything about it. He also can't do anything about the more than 100,000 artillery shells that will soon flow into Ukraine. And in the immediate sense, that's a far bigger problem for Putin because artillery is key to his invasion. He's relied upon it to batter Ukraine's defenses, meaning that any strengthening of Ukraine's artillery means a weakening of his ability to attack. Here's why that matters. At several points during the Ukraine war, Forbes defense expert Vikram Mittal has spoken about how artillery was and remains the king of the battlefield in the Ukraine war. He first made the claim in June 2024, stating that though Ukraine and Russia have adopted new tactics during their war, traditional artillery was still the major difference maker. He also had the numbers to back it up. Alongside its missile, drone and glide bomb barrages, as well as Putin's human waves of troops, Russia was firing around 10,000 artillery shells per day at Ukraine in June 2024. Ukraine wasn't defenseless on the artillery front. It was replying with around 2,000 rounds of its own daily, though it was clear that there was a disparity. That disparity was starting to pay off for Russia. Through much of 2024, Putin's forces focused on the Donetsk, Luhansk and Kharkiv oblasts. Ukraine responded by positioning its artillery in those oblasts, with Russia doing the same. Slowly but surely, Russia was making progress. Its artillery barrages allowed it to make progress in these targeted areas, resulting in it controlling 99% of Luhansk and 70% of Donetsk by the time the war rolled into 2025. Putin's strategy was simple but effective. He essentially used his artillery to create meat grinders in these oblasts. Artillery shells would batter Ukraine's defenses, weakening them until Putin felt confident to send mechanized units and human waves of Russian soldiers in for attacks. Those units would be pelted by Ukraine's artillery, with Putin appearing willing to sacrifice as much of his people and equipment as it took to claim territory. These are tactics pulled straight out of World War I, but their age doesn't matter to Putin. He's waging a war of attrition, and artillery is key to the success of that war. Fast forward to March 2025, and Mittal claimed that artillery is still king in Ukraine. By that point, Ukraine's artillery accounted for the majority of the hundreds of thousands of troops' casualties Russia had experienced up to that point. However, it was being superseded by Ukraine's drones. Part of the reason for that came down to Ukrainian drone production. Ukraine's factories built 2.2 million of these unmanned devices in 2024 and are shooting for a target of 4.5 million in 2025. More drones being available obviously meant higher usage, leading to more Russian casualties. But another major factor in drones overtaking artillery when it came to Russian casualties was that Ukraine was running low. Howitzers were in increasingly short supply as Russia's artillery assaults damaged Ukraine's defenses. Those that were still on the battlefield had less ammunition to fire at Russia. If nothing was going to change, Putin may finally be able to make his artillery advantage count. Only that's not happening. Denmark has played a key role in helping Ukraine to maintain its artillery-based defenses. Take the Danish model mentioned earlier as an example. Denmark's investment in Ukraine's defense industry has helped it get to a point where it's building 40 of its 2S-22 Bodana self-propelled howitzers every month. Those numbers will likely grow deeper into 2025, especially if more countries start following the Danish model. Now, with its nearly $600 million donation to the Czech Ammunition Initiative, Denmark is doing everything it can to ensure those new howitzers have plenty of shells that can be fired at Russia. The timing of all of this couldn't be better. After pushing its artillery advantage through much of 2024, Russia is starting to slip. There were signs of this in January when 1945 noted that Ukraine was starting to put severe pressure on Russia's artillery force with a combination of drone warfare and intelligent counter-battery techniques. Russian rocket launchers were starting to disappear from the front lines, with Russia being forced to halve its artillery fire by the beginning of the year. By April, Ukraine had specific numbers to back up these claims. Its military's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, noted that at one point, Russia was firing up to 40,000 artillery shells at Ukraine daily. That number has declined to 23,000, with Ukraine's long-range strikes against Russian ammunition stores adding to its drone and counter-battery tactics. Now, compounding the problem for Russia is the issue of shell availability. Again, 1945 highlighted this as an issue back in January, noting that Russia was being forced to rely on outdated Soviet-era stockpiles and North Korean artillery shells to sustain its barrages. Putin also has to deal with the fact that his defense industry can't keep up with Russia's rate of artillery loss in Ukraine. That's according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which said in February that Ukraine claimed to have destroyed 13,050 Russian artillery systems by the end of 2024. ISW points out that these figures could be disputed. It says that Oryx, an open-source intelligence platform, has visually confirmed the loss of at least 460 towed and over 900 self-propelled Russian artillery systems. The real number for losses likely lies somewhere in the middle of the Ukrainian and Oryx numbers. But even if Oryx is right, Russia is currently only capable of building around 100 artillery gun barrels annually due to only having 2 factories for the job. All of this amounts to Russia losing its artillery advantage. It's not building enough new guns and is relying on ancient shells and its few foreign partners to keep its artillery firing. At the same time, Ukraine's building 40 howitzers per month and getting shells from its partners to level the playing field. What Denmark has done with its latest donation is power up Ukraine's artillery forces at a time when Russia's artillery is at the weakest it's been since Putin invaded. That can only mean bad news for Putin as the war heads into 2025. It also can't be ignored how important the fighter jet parts and training Denmark is offering as part of its new package will prove to be. The Danes are part of the coalition of European countries that's providing F-16s to Ukraine. It's already handed over most of the 19 jets it's promised to Ukraine, all of which were upgraded with a midlife update during the 2000s. Ukraine is increasingly using those jets to both defend itself against Russia and attack the country's eastern region. This was confirmed in April by US Army General Chris Cavoli, who said, "They fly every day, they defeated large numbers of cruise missile threats, and they delivered an awful lot of offensive attacks as well, specifically bombing attacks in the east." Keeping those jets in the air requires a steady supply of parts for maintenance. Denmark just provided plenty of those parts to go along with artillery shells. That makes an already bad situation for Putin even worse. So, where does all of this leave the Ukraine war? Russia is struggling. Its artillery barrages are growing weaker by the day as Ukraine, with the help of countries like Denmark, becomes stronger. Ukraine still doesn't have the artillery advantage in Ukraine yet, but there may be an emerging turnaround that could lead to it finally overtaking Russia in terms of artillery usage as the war drags deeper into 2025 and Russia's stockpiles issues intensify. Add F-16s into the mix, which Ukraine can deploy with more freedom thanks to knowing that it's getting more spare parts from countries like Denmark, and that turnaround could happen sooner than Putin thinks. That's why Denmark's 26th round of military aid has rattled Putin so much. It comes at just the right time and included the perfect equipment to help Ukraine push on against a weakening Russia. But what do you think about Denmark's massive donation of artillery ammunition to Ukraine? How much of a difference will it make to the war? Are we seeing the start of a turnaround when it comes to which country has the artillery advantage? Let us know your thoughts below, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and information on the latest developments in the Ukraine war and other military conflicts around the globe.